Hello and welcome. My name is Basim Modiwala, Student Body Vice President at the University of Utah 2007-2008. You're listening to a podcast developed and produced by the University of Utah for your enjoyment. This program and others like it can be found on the web at www.utah.edu/podcast.
I think the best compliment I've ever received in my life was a very angry aside in the Tehran News last year that I had been, or this year, excuse me, that I had praised the 300 and Hellenism. And what the Iranian writer was angry about was that I suggested very politely that 2,500 years ago there was an autocratic government, part theocratic, in Persia, and it threatened the West, and it represented an entirely antithetical worldview to what was there in Greece. And here we were 2,500 years, and this was before Mr. Ahmadinejad spoke and said things such as there are no homosexuals in Iran, and Israel will be off the map, etc., etc. So the more things change, the more they say the same, which reminds us that there is a difference. I know that's a difference between what we call the West and the non-West. And these issues are very important right now because we're in a period of globalization. It's sort of the second or third, actually it's the third globalization. Remember, the Roman world for a period, despite what Mr. bin Laden says, North Africa and the Middle East was Roman, and it had been Hellenicized before by Alexander the Great and his successors. And now we're once again in a period where the entire world, and not by force of arms, but by osmosis, business practices, allegiance to governments, we have more democracies in the world today than we've ever had at any period in the history of human civilization. And places like India, with China, are becoming much more like us, if I could use that controversial term, than we are like them. And in our period here at home, the irony of all this change is as it expands from the center, I think at the same time there's never been a period in the West where people who were Western have so little confidence in what they have to offer the world. At the very time that India and China and South Korea and Latin America are embracing Western civilization, we in the West are questioning it. So much so that we've created this alternative protocol called multiculturalism. It sounds great, study all cultures. Two things to remember about it. The Greeks started multiculturalism with people like Xenophon and Herodotus that were inquisitive and empirical, inductive in their interest in Persia and Egypt. And second, it doesn't mean study all cultures. It means to advance them as equal to Western culture. The problem, I have no problem with that, except it's intellectually dishonest. Because privately, we in the United States, and indeed in Europe as well, we live two lives. We profess a multicultural utopia that all the world and all the cultures and all the history are of relatively equal merit, even though we see that China and India and all these countries are adopting business practices, language practices, transparencies like our own. But then we don't live this multicultural dogma. If I could be very blunt and controversial, if we all want to travel and you have a choice between flying Nigerian Airlines or United, you'll take United. If you want to go to the beach in your Speedos, you'll do it maybe in San Francisco or Great Salt Lake, but you will not do it in Tehran. If you want to say, if you happen to be an atheist, God forbid, in this audience, but if you said God is dead, you better do it in Salt Lake City, Mormon as it is, than try to do it in Saudi Arabia, where you'll be executed. I have a debate coming up with a Palestinian imam, and he was very anti-American. He's a U.S. citizen now, at his mosque. And in the preliminary discussions, I said, you realize that if I were to replicate your mosque with its equivalent, mutatis mutanda is a fancy word, with the necessary changes being made, if I were going over to Ramallah and I made a Christian church, and I started to try to convert people, I would be killed. You understand that? He said, yes. And he said something very interesting. He said, yes, but that's because our culture is not like your culture. And I said, yes, but I'm not in Palestine and you're in America. And that tells you all you need to know. We have more immigrants that come to the United States than all other countries put together each year. So whatever this thing is, it's dynamic, and we know the difference in the here and now. If I said to any of you, would you like to drink the water in Tijuana, Mexico, or in Salt Lake City? You'd want to drink it here. I just got operated for a ruptured appendix in Libya last year. Believe me, you would not want that procedure done in Libya. I would prefer it done anywhere in a Western country. Is it because of race? No. Is it because of genes? No. It's because of a particular culture, a particular way of looking at the world. What is that way of looking at the world? Primarily, it's empirical, that a person starts his existence without preconceptions. We inherited that from the Socratic tradition. We are not deductive. We don't start with a premise and make the premise fit the examples. We look at the examples, what we hear, what we see, what we smell, and then we come up with conclusions about it. The scientific method. Sometimes the conclusions can not only be controversial, but they can end with your life, as we saw in the case of philosophers and scientists in the Middle Ages. What else is this Western idea? It's the idea that a person, an individual, has inalienable rights. We see that best epitomized in our own Constitution, but it goes back to Greece. We go back to constitutional history in classical Greece. We see that individuals have names called polites, citizens. That word does not exist in the Egyptian dialect, any Egyptian dialect, the Egyptian language, the Persian language. There's no sense for politeia, constitution. There's no word equivalent of eleutheria anywhere in ancient Persian, anywhere in Turkish, anywhere in the Arab world today. That's why when the controversial idea of bringing democracy to the ancient world, notice that the Arabs use the word democracy. It's not because they like the West or Greece in particular, but there's no other equivalent because there's nothing in their experience that would need a word for it. Besides this commitment to individuality, there's a notion of private property holding. I wish I could tell you that constitutional government emerged in Greece to promote equality, but it didn't. It was the protection of individuals' private property in the 7th century and the ability to pass it on to an heir without coercion or confiscation from the state, which was pretty much the norm. In Persia, every single person by definition was a slave of an augmentative king. He could confiscate property when and where he wanted. In contrast, Isocrates said, even though Hellenism means speaking Greek, anybody can be a Hellene by his mind, his heart, his spirit. You can become a Westerner. Any of you today wants to become a Chinese citizen, I don't think you'll ever fully be accepted because you do not look Chinese. Or you can't say that you were born in China. But in this room tonight, we have people whose native language was not English, and they were not born in the United States, and they can become, if they choose, more Western or more American than anybody in this country. Because Westernism is an idea, and that idea had its roots, albeit with a particular race and a particular language, in Greece. We also know that there's a free market, and the Greeks were very aware of that people could buy and sell things without government coercion. There was a notion that the civilian government controlled the military rather than vice versa. Greek generals looked like civilians. They did not go into the agora or the dikasterion, or they did not go into the assembly, the ecclesia, with a uniform on. They were civilians first, and they were audited. And as I said earlier today in a speech, I can't think of whether we talk about Lysander or Pericles or Nicias or Alcibiades or even a Spartan king who was subject to constitutional audit, who was not at one time brought before the court or executed or tried because the civilians controlled the military. That's a very important Western legacy that distinguishes us today. We don't see, for all your criticism of George Bush, we do not see him with epaulets and sunglasses, as we do in Pakistan, for example, or as we do in Syria today, or we saw in Iraq. That notion of civilian control of the military is a uniquely Western idea, as is religious tolerance. The Greeks had their traditional gods, but in 5th century Athens, they had everybody from Pythagoreans to Orphics to later Stoics and Epicureans. People were free to philosophize, if you will, in a way that was absolutely unknown during the time and is absolutely unknown in most of the places today. As I said, of the 1 billion people in the Muslim world, if you were to set up a church and try to convert people to Christianity, you'd probably be killed. I can't think of a Muslim country that would allow you to go into that country today and do what Muslims do in a Western country. There's an asymmetry, in other words, that's uniquely Western. There's this idea of constitutional government, so controversial today. Can you, by force of arms, as we did in Italy or South Korea or Germany, can you, by force of arms or by persuasion or coercion, make people be Western, as we're trying to do in some cases, 2 cases in the Middle East, in Afghanistan and Iraq? But the idea that democracy, or constitutional government, I should say, is preferable for most people, that it appeals to the innate desires and aspirations of people, that is a Greek idea, best summed up in the second book of Thucydides by Pericles in his famous oration at Athens. And most importantly, this idea of self-critique, the idea that you take something and tear it apart, and you're constantly criticizing the status quo. Did you notice that when bin Laden gave his tape not long ago, he quoted Noam Chomsky and Michael Schur? And when he gave his speech at Columbia, he made a very silly mistake, because being a non-Western, he thought Westerners could criticize their government more than I do, and I'll just take their talking points. So he immediately started out with a very liberal audience and said Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, Katrina, all the talking points, and everybody sort of clapped. And then he got on to gays, and he said, but we don't like homosexuality, and stopped. And what he didn't realize is he didn't understand the complexity of the Western experience. He just was copying people who critique it. But just because you critique Guantanamo or Katrina does not mean that you believe in theocracy in Iran, as he seemed to think. And bin Laden seems to think when he quotes us so well. Let me just ask everybody, what does Hellenism mean? What is Greeks, the Western tradition? We use this term Western very loosely. I know when I was a young academic, I was 30, I had been farming for a number of years. I came into my first class, and some people wanted to help me, so they said, well, we're going to have a lecture, a formal lecture at noon on the Western tradition for you. So I came, and 17, 20 ag students came in from Fresno State, big ag department, and I started to speak, and they all walked out. And some of them said, I thought this was going to be on High Noon and Shane, and it was the Western experience, but they had no idea what the West was. Because we use that term loosely, but we never take the trouble to define it, do we? We never do. And as I said earlier, it's not something that's shared by most people. That's the most controversial thing today to say in America, that most people in the world still, even though globalization and Westernization are spreading, find the Western experience antithetical. And they have different traditions. They have different traditions. But we loosely define this Western experience as a commitment to individual rights, free expression, self-critique, constitutional government, free economic activity, secular government, religious tolerance. Now, where did this come from? I think everybody here can say, well, the United States had a wonderful constitution. We had an original group of thinkers, Hamilton, Jefferson, Franklin, people like that. And they got their ideas, of course, from people like Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau and David Hume and people in the British, Scottish, French Enlightenment. And these people, of course, were working on an earlier tradition that was formed in the Reformation and the Renaissance. And that was a basis of some great scholastic thinking. We had the Magna Carta very early. In the Middle Ages, the Middle Ages rediscovered after the Dark Ages the Roman Republic. Roman Republic's ideas, if you look at Cicero, he was a great mass disseminator of Greek thought. We can go through the Hellenistic period, and we go to classical Greece of the 5th century and a little bit in the 6th, 7th, and it stops. By that stops, I mean there is no Mycenaean text that we know of. There is no Assyrian. Somebody said, well, Gilgamesh. Well, that's an epic, but it's very different than the Iliad. There's no character portrayal. There's no values that are discussed. They say, well, Hammurabi have a law code. No, it's not a law code. It's not something that was adjudicated by a judiciary and approved by a majority vote. It's handed down on high by Hammurabi. It's very different. These values that we're talking about were created in the Greek city-states. How that happened, I once wrote a book, The Other Greeks, to try to explain how it happened, but it's one of the great mysteries of human experience, that in a little country of 50 or 60,000 square miles, 2,700 years ago, with a population of probably 1 million to 1.5 million, suddenly had this explosion in intellectual energy. And it's at roughly within 100 years, they created the idea of philosophy, the idea that you could speculate about natural phenomenon without it being tied in or embedded with religion, that there was something called a sun and there was water, and these were not just Poseidon and Helios, that these were natural phenomena, and they had characteristics, you can investigate them, and you could do so freely. And this would evolve into the Socratic, the Platonic, and the Aristotelian tradition. They created the idea of history. History did not exist until the Greeks were there. It was not inquiry or discussion, it was just record keeping. If you go to Persepolis, you see, I, Darius, did the following. I killed the following people, I enslaved. You pick up Herodotus and said, why did the Greeks do this? How did they do it? And you discuss and you attack other historians. It's a whole different process. They created the idea of oratory, the idea of public speaking, and how you address people, and how you try to persuade, the art of persuasion, sometimes called sophistry. They invented the idea of drama, dramatic presentation, and comedy, the idea that you could make fun of fellow citizens. You can't have comedy where you don't have freedom. We know that in the Muslim world today. You don't have anything like Saturday Night Live. You wouldn't have Saturday Night Live in Tehran. You'd be executed. Bill Maher makes fun of the United States all the time. If he tried it in the West Bank, he'd be killed. He knows that. Everybody knows that. You can't do that even today, but you could do that 2,700 years ago. So it was a very unique idea that all of these genres were created, and most importantly, embedded within the core of it was a self-critiquing idea, because as some of the opponents of this system, and there were many, Plato among them, suggested there's no end to it. Remember what he said, the dogs and the donkeys are going to be voting, because if you believe people are free, quote unfree, then why not women, why not slaves, why not animals, why not anything? There's no end to it. So this was a radical evolutionary process that we're still in the middle of today. After all of these evolutions, we're still arguing who should be a citizen. I went to a conference not long ago and someone said, well, a man of the left said, you know, the problem with voting is that you're free to vote, and then people who register have more money and capital, maybe, maybe not. Then the people who turn out to vote on election day tend to have more capital, and we are not very representative. So I suggest that we give people who make less than $30,000 3 votes. And I said, you know, you remind me of something out of Aristotle's Politics, where he said that democracy was really power of the people who didn't have cash, capital, or silver in those days. But the point I'm making is there was a critique and there was an evolutionary process that how do you make people more and more equal? You can do it by law, but then it doesn't work by reality sometimes, because we're not born into the world equal. These are issues that the Greeks struggled with all the time. What I'd like to do is to offer you 2 or 3 critiques of the Hellenic system. It's very important, as I said earlier, that if globalization is Westernization is a combination of the Enlightenment, the Reformation, the Founding Fathers, the Renaissance, Roman culture, the blending and merging with Christianity. All of that starts with Greece. In some ways, globalization is the embodiment, the reification of Hellenism. What's the usual take on it? What are the people who are critics of Hellenism in the West, what do they say? Well, the most obvious is, in our experience, in our lifetime, in our generation, is the left. And they've said that the United States, Europe, the colonial powers were inherently racist and sexist. Now, how do they come to that conclusion? Well, what they do is they look at contemporary society. If you're a professor, say, right in the University of Utah, let's say you're an English professor and you have a pretty good life, you have lifetime employment, maybe you make $120,000. I don't want to put words in, no, I get a lot of no's. But if you've been there a while, you might, and you have a nice car in a suburb, and life is pretty good. And you look back at antiquity and you look at the Greeks and you say, oh my gosh, women couldn't vote. They had slaves. They're terrible people. I would have never done that. And there's 2 things to keep in mind. Number one, they didn't have vacuum cleaners and stoves, so that most people were one harvest away from oblivion, but so were everybody else in the ancient world. But second is, they were aware of these contradictions, and they asked themselves really pointed pointed questions they didn't always have answers for. So we look at Sophocles, for example. Look at the plays with the names of women, Antigone, or look at Euripides, Helen, or look at Aristophanes, Lysistrata. So in all of these plays, the heroines are women who are smarter than duds like Creon. Or Lysistrata has an answer to end the Peloponnesian War. If you're Alcidemus, the famous 4th century rhetorician, you say that why no man is born a slave. Or if you're Aristotle and you start the Politics, you say, unlike my critics, I believe there is a natural slave, somebody who's genetically inferior. But he says, unlike my critics, meaning most people who are writing philosophy are taking the other tack, that people should not be slaves. And we have this idea of the poor. And we have so many words for the lower classes, the thetes, the penetes. The thetes and the penetes are the people who don't have capital. In Athens, they are trying always to agitate for social justice. And this is a philosophical question, not about compensation, but why does somebody have to, why is a smart man behind the plow and getting almost nothing on his farm, and a very dull man who inherited money is riding around on a horse? It's not equal. And so the Greeks tried to discuss this either with political reform, and sometimes it was quite wild. I don't think the world has ever seen a socialist system like classical Athenian democracy, where all the offices were held, except for the generals, by lot, and there were liturgies that confiscated the wealthy's money and redistributed it. It's very radically egalitarian. That was a system. That was one way of dealing with these contradictions in the human experience. The other was to create a philosophical and a religious critique of that. It's the basis of Christianity, pre-Christian, but the idea is that life is not fair. And just because you don't get enough compensation and somebody else does, doesn't mean that they're going to be happy or they're going to go to a better place when they die, and we're all going to die. So there were these discussions that were going on all the time. So when somebody today says, well, I don't like the West because it's colonial and racist and sexist, what they really mean is that because the West empowers the individual, both economically and politically, that individual will have more influence than a subject or a serf in the Chinese tradition, in the African tradition, in the Native American tradition. Now, when I mean influence, he will be able to go outside his shores and build things like galleons or create advanced weapons, like in the 18th, 17th century, or sophisticated navigation, because he will draw on the whole menu of the Greek tradition, and he will have influence, global influence that's not definable by the small territory of Europe or the small number of people, relatively. And therefore, whatever he does wrong will impact more people. But what we forget in this equation is that the sins of the West are the sins of mankind. The Arab world had more slaves than the Western world, and when the Western world exported 11 million slaves to the New World, the Arab world took 11 million slaves from Africa to the Gulf and other Muslim countries. But the difference is that not only was there a Western tradition going back to the Greeks that questioned slavery, but the British Empire put an end to it. And finally, we fought a war and lost 600,000 Americans. There was slavery until 1920 in the Arab world. And people suggest today in places like the Sudan and Somalia, there's still slavery. You talk about sexism. Yes, all countries have this tradition because women are responsible for childbearing. They're not as strong physically as a rule, and their lives are centered around children. There was less opportunity for education. And this was known to the Greeks, and they had laws that reflected that bias, but they also, as I said, had this dissonant critique. And so it's no accident that that evolutionary period would see women more empowered today. So today we are worried that in this constant questioning that women are worried about the glass ceiling or whether we have income parity across gender lines. But nobody in the United States is agitating against forced female circumcision. 500,000 women were circumcised. It's a little different than male circumcision, by the way, as you know, in the Sudan last year. Nobody's talking about polygamy now. I shouldn't say that in Utah. But the point is that the West, of all the places in the world, is empowering women. We talk about class strife. Marx was a Westerner. The idea that people should have egalitarianism in the economic system, even if the political system gives you freedom, but it doesn't ensure egalitarianism. GM went on strike this week. So these issues are still here, and we're still critiquing our system. And it's not happening in the Muslim world or the Chinese world. It's no accident today. It was a time bomb that was waiting to go off that our paint or our pharmaceuticals or our pet food or our toys coming from China would be defective and dangerous, because they do not have an independent Food and Drug Administration, and they do not have an open press, and they don't have investigative journalism, and they don't have university research centers as we do. And it's no accident today that in the Muslim world that people are trying to assassinate reformers. And it's no accident today that the one country, whatever your views are in the Middle East, Israel, that has adopted a Hellenic system, open judiciary, transparency, free press, market-driven capitalism, creates more goods and services without oil than Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco put together, and has twice the gross domestic product, the per capita income, twice what Saudi Arabia has, with 6 million barrels exported at $80 a barrel. That's what Hellenism does in the real here and now. So the critique that it's somehow illiberal is just simply that, like all of us, we have these innate prejudices. But when you're a Westerner and you have these innate prejudices, two things happen. One, you're able to do things that other people can't, because there's no restrictions on political and economic activity. And B, you have a system that questions. So we air our dirty linen, we're harder on ourselves than we are others, and then we're the people who change the world. So naturally, the most visible sign of Hellenism today is the United States. That's why it's both hated and loved more than any other society in the United States. It can change things. It can change things in the Middle East. It can change things in the environment. It can do great, evil, good, whatever your perception is. And it's constantly critiquing itself. And that's why, as I say, most people are dying to get to the United States, even though they say that they don't like it. And it's we are what Athens was in the ancient world. Hated and loved because it was the most dynamic and the most self-critical and gave the most ammunition to its enemies, and felt that that was positive for its own evolutionary course. There's also a critique, and it's on the right. Not that we are colonialist, or we're sexist or exploitive or racist, or we had slavery, but that there is so much wealth and so much leisure that we basically have no life, we have no culture, we have no values. We turn on Oprah, and then we go to Domino's Pizza, and then we come back and we watch the shopping channel, and we're overweight, and we have this lifestyle that we don't appreciate. We don't go for high culture anymore. This was the critique of a whole series of German nihilists, if I could use that term loosely. Oswald Spengler's Great Decline of the West, Friedrich Nietzsche's work, Hegel's work. And the idea in the Germanic tradition was, we Germans were never really colonized. We were on the other side of the Rhine. We are a Volk, a racially pure group. Western society as it came into being in Rome was racially mixed. Genes are important. We have a essence to us. Chinese believe this. You saw it in World War II. The Japanese believe it. And that if you look at what Mussolini said, what Hitler said, what Japan said, what the Muslim world says about us today is that we are spoiled, pampered, decadent, weak, can't take casualties, slaves to consumerism because of our freedom. This is what Ahmadinejad, Dr. Zawahiri had a great rant about democracy, that it enervates people, makes them weak, it turns over all responsibility for their lives, to their appetites, slaves to their appetites. The 19th hijackers, after spending some nice nights in Las Vegas, wrote wills saying that they hated what America was because of the temptations of the flesh. And this critique has been quite strong throughout the history of Western civilization. If you were to read Roman critiques, the great one is Petronius' Satyricon, great novel. So are Tacitus' Annals, Suetonius' biography. And all of those critiques, the idea is that the West has so much money that they've created what the Romans called luxus, luxury, that people do not know how to handle their bounty. And it's a great critique today. If I thought I want to answer that critique before I came tonight, and I was looking on the internet for a matter, and Britney Spears came across a picture of her in her little bikini, overweight, and she was dancing at some awards ceremony. She had no talent, I didn't think. She was crass, she had too much money, and she was an embodiment of sort of our elite in some cases. That whether it's Snoop Dogg or rap music that the world sees, there's much to be said for the crassness of popular culture. But what the West says is that people are people, and that under democracy and economic freedom, you can be what the people are, and it's incumbent upon us to make us better than we can be and not slave to our appetites. So what do we do in the West? We look toward religion, not government, religion to improve our souls. We look toward literature. We look toward secular ethicists sometimes. We look to the family. We look to our past. We have all of these institutions that we rely on to fill the void because we have decided that government should not adjudicate morality. And we are people, so sometimes when these institutions fail us or we fail each other, we can be decadent. But we have a system in place. And it's no accident today that all of the critiques from the right, whether it's fascism or Japanese militarism, German Nazism, they all, like the critiques on the left, are faded, and they're in the ash heap of history. There's been another critique of Western civilization. It's most insidious. It is popularized by Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel. He wrote a recent book called Collapse, and it runs something like this. Okay, the world is globalized, and maybe it is Western, but it's only an accident. The Greeks didn't do anything. They just happened to be born in Greece. And Greece was centrally located in the crossroads of the Mediterranean. It had a pretty good climate. They couldn't have those outdoor assemblies where they argued, could they, up in Stockholm? Wouldn't have been possible. And they had iron ores, so they had iron. Couldn't do that in many places. But when you start to make this argument of geographical determinism, then you have to eliminate every other climate like Greece, and there happens to be, unfortunately for Mr. Diamond, a lot of them in China and in India. In fact, if you were going to look at empires, I might think that the Persian Gulf was better located, because then you had water access to India and China that were massive ancient cultures in a way that poor little Greece didn't, landlocked in the Mediterranean. And it seems to me that when I go to Spain or southern France, the agricultural landscape seems to be almost the same as Greece. And more importantly, within Greece, we can use a laboratory to test this thesis out. The Mycenaean Greeks had palatial civilization between 3000 and 1200 BC. They grew olive trees. They had days that were 90, and they had very little snow and ice in the winter. They were just as close as the Egyptians, and they fell. And they left almost no record as the classical city-state. So much so that if you were a Greek living in 500 BC, you could walk like this right through the stones of Mycenae. You wouldn't know who they were. You might see some Lineard B carved on a big, a lintel. You wouldn't know who wrote it. You would say these were the walls of the Cyclops. There was somebody named Agamemnon and Atreus that lived here. There were ants, but you wouldn't know anything. It was completely a discontinuity of culture. But what I'm trying to say to you is that the city-state grew up in the same place, in the same climate, the same crops, and did something completely different than the Mycenaean. I could go run this argument ad nauseum, but I'd say to you the same is true of Egypt. Egypt collapses, 7th century BC. The Nile starts to silt up in various places. The irrigation system is not attended by the pharaohs. The land becomes salinized, and Egyptian culture becomes stagnant. It's top-heavy, it's palatial, it's government-centric, if I could use that term. There's no free citizen. Egypt's through. Jared Diamond says, see, Egypt was dependent on the Nile, and Greece had a different type. Not quite. Because Alexander comes into Egypt, he dies, the Ptolemies come over, and they become the beneficiaries of a long tradition of Greek science. Empirical, inductive, inquisitive, and people start to ask questions. Why don't we irrigate in this manner? Why don't we look at crop rotation? Why don't we see which crops work better? Let's do experiments with how much water we need. Let's see where we should let the Nile drain, where we should dam it. And pretty soon, wheat production is higher under Ptolemaic Greeks in Egypt than it ever was in the pharaohs. Same climate, same landscape, same geography. What's the missing link? The same missing link that explains why San Diego is different than Tijuana, that North Korea is different than South Korea, that old East Berlin was very different than West Berlin. It's very different. And we should ask ourselves some very tough questions when you get onto this third rail of Westernism. Why do we have 850,000 people from Mexico coming north and almost nobody coming from Canada, south? I looked at the immigration records today. 750 to 850,000 people came illegally from Mexico, plus another 160,000 legally. 25,000 came from Canada. 25,000 Americans went to Canada. If you ask me, I'd rather live in Mexico. The weather's much more like California. They've got a lot of oil. They've got a lot of natural resources. They've got a long coastline. It's a tourist haven. What's the difference? Is there some racial theory? No. Because when people come from Mexico and they become westernized, they become among our most productive citizens. What's different is that Canada is part of the British Commonwealth. The Anglo-Saxon British tradition that inherited the European tradition and inherited the classical tradition organizes its economy, its politics, and social life in a very different way that translates down to very basic facts. If you live in Tijuana and you get strep throat, you're in bad trouble. If you're in San Diego, you're not. If you drink the water out of the tap in San Diego, you're okay. If you do it in Tijuana, you're not. If somebody pulls you over off the road and you're police, you're in bad trouble. If in Tijuana, you're not in San Diego. If you want to vote in a machine in Tijuana, the machine's probably not going to work as much as in San Diego. I could go on, but that is the fact of life. Let me just conclude by saying that wherever Hellenism in its evolutionary process reaches the world, then the individual has advantages, and that creates great burdens at each opportunity. We've had dangerous Westerners who've attacked us, as I said, by Hitler or Mussolini from the right. We've had people on the left from the communist tradition that came out of the West. We have it today with the dogma of multiculturalism. But it seems to me, if we look at the greatest danger to the West in conclusion, it's not been poverty, plague, dearth, but a lack of confidence in this tradition. That we have become so enriched by this unique system of empowering the individual politically and economically and culturally that we've created a society that has so many opportunities they forgot why they had those opportunities. What were the institutions that created those opportunities? And when that happens in history, you have to be careful. You have to be careful. I'll leave you with an anecdote. In 219 to 216, as a military historian, I'll leave you with a military anecdote. The Roman Republic was threatened not only with an invasion by Hannibal, as you remember, coming from Spain across the Ebro River, but they were also at war with Greece under the successors of Philip V, the Macedonian regent in Greece. So it was not a very good time. This time, remember, Italy was only what we call Rome was only 1/4 to 1/3 of Italy. Population was probably not more than 4 million. And a series of devastating defeats at the Trebia River, at Trachinius, at Lake Trasimene, at Cana. They lost over 100,000 Roman legionaries, dead. The poor republic only had 200,000 men at arms. Now we have 1.7 million in our military. It would be as if we lost 700,000 dead men and women in Iraq in a country of 300 million. If you want to carry the parallel much greater, because it was only 4 million, then it would probably be as if we lost 5 or 6 or 10 million people in Iraq. What happened? Constitutional government jumped into operation. There were mass levies, there were constitutional conventions, there were audits of the generals. Pretty soon the Romans drafted an army. 16 years later, at Zama, they defeated them. And we know the rest of the evolution of the Roman period. Fast forward to the 5th century A.D. Is this a Roman Republic, 1/4 of Italy? No. It now encompasses 70 million people from Mesopotamia in the east to the Atlantic Ocean in the west to above Hadrian's Wall in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south. 1 million square miles. And they're attacked not by a formidable power, inheritor of classical military science like Hannibal, but a thug like Attila, and some Huns and Visigoths and Vandals. By any measure, the threat was almost nothing compared to what Rome faced when it was much, much smaller. But why in the world would a state that encompassed 70 million miles and 1 million 70 million people, a million square miles. Why couldn't they not defend themselves in a way that a little tiny, one-third the size of Italy could against much more formidable odds? And just hold that for a second and ask yourself, in the same case of Greece, why could little Greece in 480, 479 turn back 400,000 Persians? And yet in 338 it could not stop 30,000 Macedonians who came from the north. I think the answer is, and this is what I want to conclude with, that in 216 BC a Roman knew what it was to be a Roman. And they were under no illusions that they had to be perfect to be good. All they believed in, they had a illustrious tradition that was better than the alternative and could be better, even more than the alternative. In 450 AD, I don't think the average person who lived under the Roman Empire could define what it meant to be sum Romanus civis. He didn't know what it was to be a Roman citizen. He did not believe that it was any better than the alternative. And when that happens in history, history is cruel. It gives nobody a pass. If you cease to believe that your country is exceptional and has a notable tradition and that it's good without being perfect, and it's better than the alternative, and you cease to believe that, there's no reason for you to continue, and history says you won't, and you don't.
You've been listening to a podcast developed and produced by the University of Utah. Additional programs can be found on the web at www.utah.edu/podcasts.